Hi guys. Okay, today in the Percussion Revolver series we're going to talk about a recent acquisition of mine. Now, this is going to be a two-parter because there's a lot of history I want to bring up and the comparisons, and then in part two is the shooting part of this. So this week we're going to do the history. As many of you know, when I went up to the Pathfinder gathering, I happened to find something. And they don't have guns there at the gathering, but what it was is I went to the small town just down the road to pick up a pizza, and they had a small shop, and me and my friend Trinity Sainer went in there, and what they had was a Rogers and Spencer. Now, I've already done one video on this, but I want to talk about the history of this gun and how it came about. To understand where this came from, you have to go back to Whitney. When Colt had produced the Patterson, he made them himself. He'd had certain gunsmiths help him initially, but he'd gone into his own production. And then once he got it going, it just didn't fly that well. And he'd gone out of business. With the Walker coming in, and most of these stories always start with the Walker. When the Walker contract happened, where the Captain Walker showed up and said, hey, I've got military backing and I've got, government backing, and we would like to redesign and make a better gun. Colt jumped onto it, and that led to the Walker. Now, he didn't have the manufacturing capability, so he went to Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney was a large, mass-produced company that you'd come to him and say, I want to make curling irons for girls' hair, and I've got a design. He had the tooling, the machinist, the expertise to produce it. You'd come to him and say, I need spokes for a wheel, or I need, teapots, or whatever. He's a manufacturer. And he had his fingers in all kinds of markets. And the gun market to some degree. So that when Colt came to him, he said, sure. And so they produced the Walkers for the first contract. They produced some of the transition Walkers. And Colt got the tooling machinery as part of the deal, and then he went and set up his own factory. Boom. Colt then brought out the pocket gun, which was the Baby Dragoon, because he remembered in the Patterson that personal defense was a big thing. And so he went to doing that. So he knew this military contract was probably going to be big, but then it's going to filter down. So he wanted to be prepared. And so this is in the late 1840s. 47 was the Walker. Well, what happened in 49? The California gold rush. And everybody went running to California and out that way, and gold fever hit the country, and a Colt revolver on the East Coast was like $10 or $12. A pretty high sum for the day, but $10 or $12. That same gun in the gold fields of California was $500. So yeah, there was a market for people to take from here and go to there. And so manufacturers, everything started jumping on board. And so all this money coming in, Whitney looked around and said, wait a minute, didn't we, hold on a minute. How about we get into this a little bit? And so the principal rival, or competition we shall say, for Colt and the 51 Navy was the Whitney revolver, both of them in 36. Now right here I'm going to put a picture of the Whitney revolver. Okay, that was the lead competition to Colt at that time. And Whitney had got one of his engineers, one of the designers named Beals, B-E-A-L-S, to come up with that design. And so it's kind of his baby. So Whitney produced it, but it was really Beals' design. He took the Colt lock work, and so I want you to notice that the Whitney revolver has 2 screws. So it's a 3-screw, what they call, which is 1 screw that holds the main hammer, 1 screw that holds the trigger, and 1 screw that holds the bolt in the side of it. Okay? Beals then, in the late 1850s, left Whitney and got out on his own, and he produced a gun called the Beals Revolver. Here's a picture of that. Note how much it looks like the earlier Whitney. Now, in the Civil War, in the early 1860s, when you had the Confederates, they made a copy of this gun, and it is called a Spiller and Burr. And here's a picture of a Spiller and Burr. Does kind of all look alike, don't it? The big difference is the loading levers, how they attach, whether it's a big twist knob or a screw or something like that. Why didn't they put that crossbolt pin like Colt did? Colt had that patent, so they couldn't do it later on. Alright, so next, we've got the Spiller and Burr, etc. And those Spiller and Burrs too. At the beginning of the Civil War, the government was so desperate for arms, they were taking anything that had any kind of reliability and buying it. Plus, you had individual states were also buying arms. So the state of Ohio, the state of New York, wherever, was buying their own arms and equipping their own militias and National Guard units, so to speak, and actual full-time Army units. So there's a lot of competition out there looking for guns. See? And so the Whitneys were still being produced. And so they were sold in numbers to individuals like officers who were buying them, or being sold to units where this rich guy or this city or this state or these two counties, whatever, are outfitting a company of men. The pistols would be bought for them. See, so you got a large buying force here, and multiple ways these guns could be used in a lot of different ways. The Beale's revolver was being produced with Remington, because Remington wanted in on this, you know. And so that Remington Beale's, here's a picture of that, that led to the Remington Army. Now, when we look at it, in modern day we call it a 58 Remington. That is a modern name put onto the gun. In 1862, if you'd walked up and said, give me a 58 Remington, they would not have a clue what you're talking about. If you said a Remington Army revolver, they would know. Okay? But the idea they got for it was the base pin on the Beale's, Remington, etc. is separate from the loading lever. And so it slides in and out, and then the loading lever is hooked to the frame. On the Spiller and Burr and the Whitney, etc., the loading lever is attached to the base pin. And it's how they're connected. You know, but it's the same gun. You can just see where they're simplifying or whatever. So, one thing they wanted to do was, if you look on the old model Remington, and here's that picture, look underneath the barrel, between the loading lever and barrel, and there's a slot. That idea was so you could grab the base pin with the loading lever up and just slide it down and drop the cylinder out, so you could change cylinders if it fouled up. Remember, the thing that kind of ghosted all of this design all the way back to the Whitney revolver is they fouled out, meaning that flat face that held the barrel and right in front of the cylinder, they were so close that fouling built up there fairly quickly and would bind it up. It made it difficult to turn. And so therefore the guns, you had to take it out and wipe the front of the cylinder off right quick, or wipe your thumb and get the crud off so it would go back to turning. Okay? Because none of them had a grooved base pin like a Colt does to hold grease. And so they dried out through firing, especially heated firing, and they would get what was called out of time, which wasn't really time. It just meant they got sticky and you had to break them apart right quick and clean them up. And not a good thing to have in the middle of a battle. So that slide it out, pull it out, take the cylinder and wipe it on your shirt right quick, take your thumb and do and slide it back in, pop it back in, was the idea. The disadvantage was that in firing and the guns pointed down in the joust on the horse, those base pins could get a little worn and they'd slide out and your cylinder would fall out of your gun. So the Remington new model Army got rid of that feature and just made it where the loading lever captured it again. And here's a picture of a Remington New Model Army, which we in modern times call a 58 Remington. Now, early on in the war, like I said, the governments were desperate to get resources, to get guns. Colt made huge contracts, but here's one of them little things in history that you forget. There is no Colt government contract, no orders coming in after '63. All orders they made after that were Remington solid frames and other solid frame guns. The powers that be had recognized the strength of the solid frame guns and were no longer buying the Colts. Colt still had a lot of contracts they hadn't fulfilled yet. But that was the thing. Well, feedback is coming back from the troops in the field. Officers and stuff that have real world experience with these guns are now going to the gun designers, and you see little tweaks happen. Like on that base pin I told you about, it's no longer truly round. There's a bottom flat that's kind of flattened off. That allows you to pack a little grease in it, so that when you put the cylinder in there, the heat of the cylinder will cause it to melt and help lubricate the base pin. Little touches were coming in. And one of the things that they were complaining about for the Remingtons were they were too slow to cap because the opening around the nipple was too small. And so they wanted that opened up to make it easier to cap it with bare fingers, or better yet, while you were wearing cavalry gloves, to be able to cap it. You know, because your loading came paper cartridges in a little box or a little wooden block, and then a little paper tube of cap. So you had loose caps. You had to sit there and cap it. And that was hard to do in that small confined area, especially when you're hot, you're sweaty, you're tired, you're still looking over there, is that cavalry going to be coming this way or not? Things like that. And so they wanted to open that up. Well, this feedback came back, and this company of Rogers and Spencer stepped up, and they're going to take basically the same design that had been the Whitney, that had been the Beals, that had been the old model Remington, the new model Remington, the basic same design, and put improvements in it. The loading lever was thickened right there. Notice when you go back and look at those pictures of the other gun, it's like on the Spilling Burst right here, and it's round from there up. They thickened it because it liked to bend there under heavy loading because the gun was so fouled. So they thickened it up. They changed this angle and brought it out a little further so you got more camming power for loading, make it easier to load. And then look at the back of the cylinder. Look how big they dished that out back there so that when you put it on half cock, it's a big opening, and I can easily cap this thing. I don't have to have a big groove. Most of the Colts had a groove there. You can set the cap in and slide it down that groove, and it kind of lined it up to get it on there. This is a nice big opening we can put it in. So this is sort of the improvement. If you cover up some of it like that, that looks a lot like the Remington, which is a Beals, or the Spiller and Burr, or the old model, etc. It's the same basic design that they're tweaking. Okay, it's like you get this model Ford or Chevy pickup, and for the next 2 years they just change the grills and change a few things, but it's the same truck. They just put a different engine in it. Oh, we'll upgrade this, but it's the same basic chassis. This is the same basic revolver idea that came up by Beals. That was the Whitney. That was the Spiller and Burr. That was the, now these were produced by different people, different companies, but this is basically the pistol they were copying and making changes to, refinements to. And so this was basically the refinement at the end of the war. And that's where it ran into the problem, because the war ended. They had, like a lot of other things, some production problems getting it going. But once they got the gun produced, it was bigger in here than the Remington. So the hand fit it better. The swell right here of the grip fit the hand better, and more like a plowshare. It wouldn't come out whenever you're galloping on a horse and this thing is bouncing in your hand. It was hard, even if your hands were wet and sweaty, to come out of your hand. It didn't come out. The top up here swells up so it fills the hand. So the top of the grip, when you grip it, feels a lot like a Colt, to be honest. as compared to Remington. The Remington's taper right there, and all of those, these swell out more like a Colt grip did. And whenever you wrap your hand around it, that top half feels like a Colt, and its bottom flare feels more like a Remington. The best of both worlds. The hammer spur was made more vertical because of the whip shooting. You would go bang, and then they'd come up and they'd do like that. They'd hook it and flip it forward, you know, or hold it over their head to cock it. You didn't have cap jams with this because that big opening, the cap just busted and there was nothing for it to grab. So when the hammer came off of it, it just fell off. A lot less cap jamming. Like the Remington, they made more of a gap right there where the frame didn't come all the way back almost touching the cylinder. There's a gap there for that fouling for some place to go. And on the front of the cylinder itself, and let me show you that right quick, they made a little adaptation. Remember that fouling I talked about? They would get it out of battery. Well, it was because that thing was fouling up and binding it up. So what they did was, on the set that's now the loading rammer and the base pin, the bottom of the base pin is actually reduced in size. You can feel it, and there's a thicker section, a narrow section, and a thicker section. So you could smear some grease on this and get it into the hole to have lubricant so the cylinder wouldn't jam up so easy. The other thing they did was, if you look at the front of the cylinder, see this raised part right here? This bushing light? That allowed that to sit snug up against the frame, but that flash from the explosion would hit it and go around it and not bind up on the base pin, because that high pressure explosive gas was hitting and turning and going in underneath, and that was pitting it and wearing it out and causing it to foul out and jam up. By doing this, it sealed up to the frame better and less fouling. It could shoot more shots before it fouled out. Made it quicker. Made it last longer in a fight. Okay? The frame, the Remington, the Spiller and Bird, the Bills, all like that, to take it completely apart, you have to take the grips off, and then you're going to have to do some finagling to bind down and get that mainspring out. To fix that, they went to this, where they've got two screws right there, and then this one screw here. The bottom half of the frame comes off now, and so that means I can get to the internals easier by just those three little screws, pull it apart, and I can get totally the inside, the main frame, the mainspring, and etc., without having to bind it and twist it and all this stuff. It was just an easier way to manufacture instead of that solid frame. Now, this was an expedited idea, and one of the things that's a little different is Remington's and all like that. They completely cover it up, but if you look right here beside the trigger guard right there, there's a hole. That's the slot for the hand to go in. Since they removed the trigger, they could machine it all the way through. Now that's an opening that you could get fouling in there, but it also will let water out of there too. So if this was in a holster and they got a lot of water in it, it would not hold water. It would drain out. It's A, a place for fouling, and B, it's a way to drain. So those two ideas, these were the refinements that were coming out of the field. So they got the guns into production, they got them almost complete, and then the war basically ended. So, did these see combat? Yes and no. What do you mean by that? One, there are some of the Spiller and Burr that are martially proof marked. That means they were inspected and etc. and were sent out to the troops. Probably something like a state militia, a National Guard unit, somebody in the rear, etc. There were probably some individual guns that made it all the way into serving troops. But by the time this came out, it's basically 1865 and the war is basically over. You may have had people in uniform that had one of these because they were connected to whatever and they got a hold of one because it was the newest and the brightest idea. But they were not general issued and they were not in mass thing, and we don't have any documentation to show that this guy had this gun in this battle. The government didn't take possession of the big pile of them. Okay, Now, I have no doubt there were some individuals that were earmarked and bought by smaller groups that may have got. And so that's the big debate. Did these ever even see combat? Another gun in the Civil War era that's very similar in idea and etc. that is the model 1863 Remington 58 caliber musket. You probably not heard of it until I used the more common name, Zouave musket, because that was at the end of the war, and that was one too, that it was the things that were coming, the feedback coming from the field on it needs to be a little shorter, it needs to be this, simplify that, da 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 da, and that gun had gone into production, but the war ended. And so very few, if any, actually made it. Did an individual end up with it? Possible, you know. Even with the Walker run of the Colt Walkers, there was 1,000 for the military, and then there was another 100 produced because they're being given away as gifts to people influenced, as demonstration models, so to speak. So whenever these guns were had been okayed, and yes, go into production, you got a 25,000 order, whatever it is for this gun, you can bet that there was probably 100, maybe 200 that were already out in the hands of individual generals, soldiers, officers, people of influence, because they were trying to get those contracts. There was no internet to go look it up, what a picture. I had to hand you the gun for you to know what I was talking about. And so for these guys to go around to try to get these contracts, there had to be some of these guns around. And so those may have saw service, we don't know. Heck, when the guy wanted to get the contract for the Spencer, the military just blew him off, wasn't interested in it. He showed up at the White House and got Lincoln and him to go out on the lawn of the White House and do some target shooting. They put some sandbags or something up for a backstop, and Lincoln shot the Spencer. And that's how they got contract, was because the president said, yeah, buy some of them. You know, that's the kind of thing that was done. So the vast bulk of them, I might as well say all of them, but it's not true. There were some out, we know that much. But the 99% of them were still sitting in storage and were sold to Bannermans. And so Bannerman up there in New York took them and put them in his catalog in the early 1900s. And that's the reason whenever I was starting out in the 70s, these guns were being used as target guns. And nobody was making a reproduction. They were originals that had never been issued. And they had good rifling and they were accurate and etc. And so whenever you saw an article from the early 70s talking about a Rogers and Spencer, there were no reproductions. Those were original guns that somebody back in the day had bought from Bannerman. And therefore, that was one of his guns. It was a Civil War surplus gun that had made it all the way to the modern times. And most of them were brand new in the cardboard box. Had never been fired. And so that's the reason they held up so well. I have seen 2 or 3 originals myself that were original. And then they started doing replicas because these took off on the target, the muzzleloading target matches and things like that. They proved to be very accurate. And so it was worthwhile then for them to make a reproduction of it. So that's where this comes from. This particular one was made in 1979. And like I said when I got it, I am confident that this was a Civil War officer reenactment pistol. I can tell by the overall condition of this thing's hardly, if it has ever been fired, it would probably be like 100 rounds or less. I probably fired it more than it ever has in its lifetime. It was one of those guns that probably got purchased and put into a sheath, into a holster. And how I know that it's an officer's gun, look at the butt of it. It's got that, it's been beat up, it's got this pattern all in it. That's where the saber is banging against it when he's on a horse or walking. The grips, everything, nothing's wrong with it. And so this is one of those 1979 replicas that came in that was very well made, very good quality, and I've shown shoot very well. Now, as I had said in my earlier video, in all my years of reading about these, nobody ever mentioned the chamber capacity of it. Now, a Dragoon, the Walker was the first Dragoon, It had a chamber capacity of 60 grains and a ball. They reduced that in combat because they were bursting cylinders. And so they went down to 50 grains. By the beginning of the Civil War, the ammunition that was being issued to the cavalry units and dragoon units was actually 35 to 40 grains. That was one of the reasons that Colt was able to take the 51 Navy, bore it out to 44 caliber, and get a 35 grain charge in it. So they could say that the 1860, which had kind of come out of the dragoon line, think about it, where we're taking the weight and the bulk off of the 3rd Mile Dragoon and producing a gun with the same power, because it could take the same ball and the same powder charge. See, we'll just make it a lighter, handier gun. Well, there are those in cavalry things that wanted the heavier dragoon, not so much for the fast handling. 51 Navy is a far fast handler, and so is an 1860 Army. But the dragoon, with its higher capacity, gave it more punch when you're trying to shoot oxen that are pulling a cannon, or horses or mules or things like that. It penetrated better, and you had a better chance to take out bigger game with it, because that's what they were doing in lightning raids, taking out the guys and taking out their horses and mules that pull that cannon. Because if you take out the horses and mules, you're gonna have guys trying to pull that, cannon. That eats up the time, and so it slows down armies and things like that. It's a way of crippling them. And so the capacity of it. Well, I always assumed by the size of the Rogers and Spencer that it had a chamber capacity somewhere around 40 grains, like a 1860 or a 58 Remington, because it's basically like a 58 Remington in size, right? A little awkward, but you could see, yeah, 58 Remington in size. That cylinder is not that big a difference in size from a modern 58, so it should have roughly the same chamber capacity. So when I got out here and found out that it actually, because of the way it's drilled straight down, the Colt and the 58 tapers toward the end, so you're losing capacity. It's a funnel shape. This one isn't. It's bored straight down to the bottom, and only in that last like half inch, maybe quarter inch, does it taper down to the nipple. And so it's got a higher capacity. It will hold 50 grains. So that's a dragoon power. Remember, this was feedback coming out of the field for these guys. So you could load this up like a dragoon if you needed that power, or you could load it with the standard ammunition that was like 19, 20 something grains and a conical bullet, which was what was standard issue ammunition, and have it function. So you had, like, you can put a 38 into a 357. If I don't need the 357 power, I just use the 38. Well, that's what this did. Okay, enough of the history. But that's where the gun came from. Now, I'm going to include one more picture right here, and that's, like, in my mind, the last in the line. Yes, that is a Ruger Old Army. Notice the dish out in the cylinder around the nipples, a lot like a Rogers and Spencer. Notice the loading lever rig, a lot like a Rogers and Spencer. Ruger saw what was the improvements of that day and took his modern gun, which was a single action, the old Ruger Blackhawk, and adapted it to be a black powder revolver. So it had the modern lock work in it, coil springing, etc. But at the same time, it used the old Beals loading system. Except instead of him making it where it was pinned, they hooked together where the base pin hooks to the loading lever, as opposed to them being permanently pinned together. When you look back from the Whitney, the Spiller and Burr, the Beals, the Remington, the old model Remington, the new model Remington, the Rogers and Spencer, and the Ruger, you can see the lineage of them taking an existing design, updating it, adapting it, and going with it. So you could say that Beals is as big a designer as Colt ever was, because more people have taken his design and made it up to the modern era. They make reproductions of Colts. I mean, they do make reproductions of Colts, but nobody has made a modern gun taking the Colt open top and turning it into X. It's still an obsolete design. whereas the Bills in that solid frame has became the Ruger over time. It was the inspiration, the linchpin, the link back to all the way. So that's where this came from. Okay, that's going to conclude this part one. Now I'm about to set up over here on the range and we're going to shoot. And what we're going to be shooting is, we're going to be shooting the Johnson & Dow bullet conicals over the chronograph. And then we're all going to put, also going to put the Kato Ojama hunting bullet into it and shoot it over the chronograph and see what we can get out of it. I have Pirate XP and 777. We're going to see what velocities we can get out of it. But that will be in part two. Till then, guys, thank you very much for watching my video. Do me a favor and hit that like, share, and subscribe before you go to feed the algorithm. I'll really appreciate it. Until next time, guys, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.